So good day, everyone. Welcome to our second discerning session. Um, my name is Diana Wright. I am the Director of Ecumenical and Interreligious Relations for the Presbyterian Church USA, and I serve with this group as the moderator of the discernment team. Just a way of bringing you up to date, I'm just going to do a little review of what we've been doing over the past few months. So we began this journey of discernment in December of 2020, using the theme, what does God require of us? Discerning, confessing, and witnessing in a time of COVID-19 and beyond. So the working paper that we were introduced to gave us three key concepts and three key terms. The first was global apartheid, as described by Alan Bosak as a phenomenon that includes social, economic exploitation and inequalities, political and social exclusion, racial and ethnic discrimination, as well as gender injustices and heteronormative oppression. And then we talked about the various multiple crises that include economic, environmental, racial, political, all that calls for a response from the church. And then global revolution against greed, injustices, violence, and for life, and for life, global solidarity and human dignity. In January, we introduced you to the first step, the discernment circles. In it, we heard stories of pain and injustices that help us to think about and understand what has been happening in various regions in our global community. We heard stories and input from different voices, regions, and experiences to help us name and take seriously the realities of our current world. The first focus group focused on issues affecting women and Africa. The second sharing session focused on Europe and RAND, and RAND stands for racism, authoritarianism, and nationalism. And not only did we hear the trauma and the pain from those same voices, also came a sense of hope and transformation as we undertake this journey with God. You can hear and read some of the reflections from those conversations because they are available to you on our website. Today we move from discernment to confession, and we introduce you to the confessing circle. This second of the 4 circles on confessing will run through Lent and Easter to Easter. As noted in our first working paper, Accra confession quite deliberately aligns itself with the confession of Belhar and asks us the question, are we ready to show the difference between being a confessing church and a church with a confession? For Belhar, that means that the church is called to stand where God stands, namely with the poor, the oppressed, and against any and all forms of injustice. And so we understand that this is a moment of truth, a moment for the church to take a stand and act in justice, love, and mercy. So today we continue by introducing you to our working paper in 3 segments: engaging our confessions, confessing guilt, and becoming a confessing church. Each segment will begin with a time of worship, reading a portion of the working paper, and then sharing some time in small groups, except for the last segment will actually end with worship. So we continue as we begin with the words from our President Najla Kassab. We gather today to engage in thinking together. What does the Lord require of us? We gather to affirm our steady journey towards justice. It is our road to seek new ways of strengthening the communion and transforming the world to dream of new alternatives and new visions of a reality based on justice. And so we invite you to participate with us as much as possible as we go through our sessions today. Welcome. Let us begin with our opening worship segment.
Thank you. Friends, may I give you a minute? And if you'd like to, we are not requesting this from everyone, but if you would like to bring a bowl of water and a towel, please, for this act of worship, if you have one. A bowl of water and a towel.
Oh, water and a towel.
I will move my screen a bit so that you may see the bowl of water and towel that I have. And we will begin in a minute. Just giving enough time for people to return if they have. Let us begin. If we have the next slide, please.
Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." Mark 15, verse 37 until 39. Jesus gave a loud cry.
The image on the left is of Angel, Ma Kiel Sin, a young Myanmarese woman who was killed while demonstrating against the military coup in her country. Confession is at once rage and defiance. And it is the cross that calls us to root our faith in rage and defiance. To be resilient in the face of the old order and cursing it with the blessing of our resistance. Just like Ma Kielsen and several others in Myanmar, others around the world, confession announces a judgment which cannot be silenced and a new world which can only be delayed. Let us wash our hands. Mindful of the cruel indifference it exposes at the heart of the current order. Mindful, we too will need to prepare the dead in this struggle. And washing our hands of the insipid faith, we must repent. Amen.
Amen.
We will now have Dr. Bosak read to us the first part of the working paper.
Thank you, and good afternoon, all our brothers and sisters. As we enter into the second wider circle of answering the question, what does God require of us? Discerning, confessing, and witnessing in a time of COVID-19 and beyond, we must then ask the question, what does it mean to confess for us? For the Reformed Communion, at this critical juncture, perhaps the idea of confession can be fleshed out in three different ways. One, we are engaging with our confessions. We are a confessional body. The World Communion of Reformed Churches is a communion of churches that draws from the Protestant traditions of the 16th century and particularly from the theology of John Calvin. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century was not only a religious reformation that asserted certain theological principles, but these theological principles also emerged from and engaged with economic and political ideals. In many ways, the Protestant Reformation was a reaction to the increasing commodification of society, in which everything, including salvation, was reduced to a value in the market. It's precisely in this context that grace emerges as a theological principle to indicate that not all of life can be subsumed to a monetary value, and that salvation was not for sale. It was a strong assertion that not all of life could be monetized. To own Calvin's legacy is to assert that the economic system served human interest and particularly the interest of the poor. Calvin's gift in the present time should encourage us to engage with economic systems contextually and pastorally from the perspective of justice, ensuring that our economy serves people's interests and not the large multinational companies. And today we once more assert that we cannot monetize faith or let it be co-opted for the sake of profit. The legacy of Calvin calls us to place life before profit, to put back the protest in Protestant. But the Protestant Reformation was also a political and specifically anti-imperialist faith. It was a move away from Rome's hegemony to assert the independence and autonomy of the city-states. While it is undeniable that the city-states had their own systems of exploitation, particularly of the surrounding rural areas, this was a significant move away from the imperial logic of the Roman See. It was also this anti-imperial logic that paved the first inroads for democracy, autonomy, and human dignity. This logic came into its fruition in the Synod of Emden, which rejected a hierarchical church structure and instead suggested that no congregation should claim priority or rule over other congregations, no pastor over other pastors, no elder over other elders, no deacon over other deacons. To be a confessional body is also to claim our communion and our unity. There is a need to theologically re-signify our understanding of unity. And when we argue that the church is one, we are claiming a unity of which Christ is the head. This implies that the unity of the church is directed to the ends that Christ himself taught us. That is to say, that we are united not for exerting power, but rather for the sake of powerlessness. And this can be expounded as Christology of kenosis, where Christ, in the giving up of his divinity, reconciles the world to himself and to each other. It is in the giving up of power that true communion is served. It is an active act of humility that brings into question the evil machinations of power. Moreover, communion is to be directed towards the sake of justice. The unity that the church is called into is the unity of and for the sake of the oppressed and the marginalized of the world. It is a unity that has its heart in decentering of illegitimate power and drawing into focus the margins of our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for that reading of the first portion of our working paper. So we've got two questions for you this morning as we, when you will, after you get to your breakout groups, in terms of the first section on engaging our confessions. One, which of the traditions in churches and ecumenical organizations do we see as resources that inspire and sustain us in the current crises? So think about that. And then the second question, where do we see the protest in the Protestant tradition? Think about that, and perhaps even if you've got some questions for clarification or reflection from that section of the paper that you just heard Alan read, you may, maybe you want to raise it or add that to the chat as well. Well, welcome back, everyone. I know I didn't want my session to end. We were just getting down to some great conversation. I look forward to reading some of the things that were happening in your groups. But as we continue, we will go on to our second portion of our working paper, Confessing Guilt, and we will again begin with a time of worship with Philip and Metta.
Later.
Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." Mark 15, verse 37 to 39. The curtain was torn in two.
The image on the left is of a statue that pays homage to the many Korean comfort women. Confession is at once eruption and disruption. The resurrection requires an insurrection. The truthful word deed breaks open the old order and invites the new world. And we remember Korean comfort women, their perseverance, their refusal to be silent, their eruption. In breaking silence, they opened the way for a new world still being resisted. How could the people come to the temple again and not see a repaired or replaced curtain as ever torn. Let us wash our hands. Mindful of the cruel indifference it exposes at the heart of the current order. Bathing in tenderness those who are wounded, and washing our hands of the insipid faith we must repent. Two of you are invited to respond to this in any way that you would like.
I am mindful of how easy it is for me to get water from my faucet and how many places in the world clean water is not readily available.
Let us keep a moment's silence. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Philip and Martha, for that time of worship and reflection. We will move on now to the reading of the second part of our working paper with Rathanakara, and then we will go back to our breakout groups, but we'll have the reading of our paper first. Thank you.
Confessing guilt. But to confess also means that we confess our sin, our complicity in systems of oppression. The Reformed churches bear the double edge of the theological basis of oppression, as well as offering the theological resources of resistance to it. Reformed theology was the theology of the slave owners and was the basis on which opposition to slavery also emerged. Apartheid was a reformed theology, but resistance to apartheid again emerges from the reformed traditions. Our collaboration is in our silence and in the active oppression of racialized communities, the poor, the marginalized, women, and people with sexualities that question the normative. Bonhoeffer reminds us the church confesses that it has witnessed the arbitrary use of brutal force, the suffering in body and soul of countless innocent people, that it has witnessed oppression, hatred, and murder without raising its voice for the victims and without finding ways of rushing to help them. It has become guilty of the lives of the weakest and most defenseless brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ. We speak much against empire, but we are also churches that often act as empire, which in the first circle we identified as global apartheid. In some contexts, the national church has sided with the imperial designs. We are no longer a minority who is being hunted down by empire, but the church today is empire. We are powerful and are responsible for much exclusionary violence around the world. The fact is that we have the privilege, and we have to be able to unlearn our privilege. We would argue that we have to unlearn our privilege and see our privileges as our loss. That precisely because we as a church are in positions of power. We can no longer speak the truth that we are losing out on salvation as a result. We need to defamiliarize and unlearn our notions of power as individuals and as institutions as well. We have to learn some humility and set out to learn from the very people we intend to teach. To confess our sin is to be able to unlearn and listen to those voices from the margins and allow ourselves to be led by them. But we also account for the silent among us who are forced into silence, those against whom violence has forced silence on, those victims of brutal systems of patriarchy, capitalism, racism, casteism, whose silence is not complicity, but a confession of resistance and non-compliance.
Thank you for that reading. It now takes us to a more time of discussion as we look at the two questions for the second breakout session. I will read them for you as Philip and others put it in the chat on confessing guilt. Where do we see churches and ecumenical organizations witness oppression, hatred, and murder without raising its voice for the victims? And where do we see churches and ecumenical organizations acting as empire by abusing power and privilege and by calling, justifying, and condoning exclusionary violence? So those are your two questions for your time of reflections in our small group chat time that will begin right now. Those questions should be in the chat. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope everybody's been gathering back. Had the same, ran out of time before we finished our conversation. So again, I look forward to hearing some of your responses from our scribes. We're going to move on now to our third section of the paper and reading part 3 of the working paper. Alan, I believe that is you again.
Somebody's making me sing for my supper, so. Part 2.
Send me, Lord.
Yes. Thank you, Chairperson. We are coming to the third part, becoming a confessing church. We also need to move away from these notions of confession and confession towards being a confessing church, a living confession, to embrace the spirit of resistance that is to be found in the Barman Declaration, the Belhar and Accra confessions, to affirm that Jesus is Lord and that all other claims to lordship are idolatrous. that neither the market, political systems, race, or gender has the right to lord it over others because only Jesus is Lord. That we are called to reject any ideology which would legitimate forms of injustice and any doctrine which is unwilling to resist such an ideology in the name of the gospel. The Accra Confession calls the faithful to understand that justice is a matter of faith. It is a matter of confession. It is the very heart of God. To put it in other words, it is not Christians who should be involved with acts of justice. Rather, it is doing acts of justice that make us Christian, as the Accra Confession puts it, and I quote, speaking from our Reformed tradition and having read the signs of the times, the General Council of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches affirms that global economic justice is essential to the integrity of our faith in God and our discipleship as Christians. We believe that our faith's integrity is at stake if we remain silent or refuse to act in the face of the current system of neoliberal economic globalization. Therefore, we confess before God and one another, end quote. In our outline of the COVID-19 and beyond process, the ideas of confession are designed to align with Lent and Easter. In preparing this document, we were reminded that the church tends to move too quickly beyond Lent, past Good Friday and Holy Saturday, and into Easter, to embrace hope without the pain of passion. Good Friday is too close for many of our communities, and Easter Sunday is yet too far away. In a context where dominant forces have co-opted hope to maintain rather than challenge the prevailing social structures. But we also learn from the women around Jesus. Women were present at the birth, at his ministry, and in the cross of Jesus in his crucifixion. Women in the Gospels are shown to be what the models of discipleship are, but are never believed, never listened to, not in the Gospels and not in our times. Those who carried perfumes and spices, swaddled and anointed, while the men misunderstood, denied, and brought whips and nails. While the men were staring at the semi-darkness of the upper room and the mesmerizing gloom of Saturday, the women were already turning their faces to the rising sun of Resurrection Sunday. In the Gospels, the passion of Jesus is met with two confessions. One of the centurion, who confessed Jesus as the Son of God. Of course, looking up at the man dying on the cross and comparing him to Caesar was an anti-imperial stance. But the church has taken the same narrative, fixed Jesus on the cross, the Christ becoming the legitimization of suffering, the emblem of imperialism that calls for suffering and seeks to take away life. But there is also another confession, Mary's confession, who confessed Jesus as Rabboni, as he wanted to be approached no longer as master, but as a friend who had laid down his life for the other. Not a glorification of suffering, but instead as Emmanuel, as God with us, who walks with us, accompanies us, to answer us when we ask, what does God require of us? And the answer is that we confess a cross that is a revolt against a scandalous world. In the cross, we find the power of God who acts to annul the power of the forces of death. It is powerlessness confronting illegitimate power and emptying it. The cross and the resurrection are not events that are meant to be venerated, but are instead God's revolt against a scandalous world. It is a call to action for the church to join the revolution of the powerless against the powerful, to be with the people's movements on the margins. It is the power of Jesus that is the power of the powerless. And this is made true to us in the story of the Passion. As he enters Jerusalem from the east, it is a counter procession to the one the governor and the Roman legions are staging from the west. Theirs with armies and horses and chariots and weapons of war, representing the empire of oppression, exploitation, and enslavement. Jesus enters riding on a donkey, surrounded by the poor and the oppressed. But the clang of weapons and the sounds of might on the other side of the city are no match for the songs of praise and the shouts of joy of the poor. The Roman procession is a show of violent, destructive, exploitative power. The Christ procession is a display of joy, faith, and courage which the empire cannot even begin to comprehend. That is the power of the powerless. Before Pilate, the governor, the hegemon, and before the high priest, Jesus stands as the accused. He is expected to bow to their will, to plead for mercy, to beg for his life. Pilate's question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" is not innocent. He is giving Jesus an out, an opportunity to deny, and thereby willingly, pleadingly putting his life in Pilate's hands. Jesus refuses. "You said it." In other words, "You know I am," which means I am challenging the authority and legitimacy of your Caesar and your empire. What I cannot be, what I am, cannot be diminished or taken away by you. That is the power of the powerless. On the cross, Jesus annuls the power of death and of the principalities who put him there. They think they have accused, judged, and found him guilty, that they now have the right to condemn him to his most horrific death the empire could conceive. But the crucifixion is the death Rome reserved for runaway slaves, rebels, and revolutionaries whose threat to the empire was so severe that this was the empire's only way to stop them. And so even in the crucifixion, they acknowledge that his is a power that threatens the mightiest power on the face of the earth. But this is the power of the powerless.
Thank you again, Alan, for that reading. I appreciate it. You did your job very well. Thank you. So we move again to our next session of our time together in breakout groups, our third session, looking at 2 additional questions that you'll again find in the chat in our 3 different languages. Becoming a confessing church. So where do we see churches and ecumenical organizations acting as living confessions, resisting the global apartheid, which is hardening in many parts of the world? And finally, how can the WCRC join the joyful Christ procession to enter Jerusalem with Jesus, riding on a donkey, surrounded by the poor and oppressed, to challenge the violent, destructive, and exploitative powers? So we'll give you another 20 minutes or so to take a look at those questions in your breakout groups. Well, I know I was cut off in the mid-speech. Thank you so much. I know we're nearing the end of our time together, but thank you so much for the work that we have been doing together in this session. I am grateful for your presence with us today, and would invite you to continue on this journey with us through the Lenten and Easter season. We will continue our sessions with 2 sharing sessions that will come up in April. One, the focus group is on people living with disabilities, and the other on Israel and Palestine. And we have invited 2 regions to be with us, and we need to confirm those, but Indonesia and the Middle East, as we begin to think about what's going to happen next on our next sharing sessions. But I'm sure you will receive information about those sharing sessions coming up. Hans, is there anything else that we need, and Philip, anything else that we need to say before we move on to closing worship?
Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." Mark 15, verse 37 to 39. Truly this man was God's son.
But our confession has also been co-opted. It has been used by empire to further the causes of global apartheid. Confession has become idolatry that is masked behind a veneer of orthodoxy. The centurion who confessed Jesus as the Son of God, of course, looking up at the man dying on the cross and comparing him to Caesar, was an anti-imperial stance. But the church has taken the same narrative and fixed Jesus on the cross, nailed him back to the cross. The Christ becoming the legitimization of suffering and the emblem of imperialism that calls for suffering and seeks to take away life. Let us take up these waters, font of failure, cup of suffering, waters of new birth, promising to pour out the waters and the ways we have. Allowed our systems, lives, and faith to be cruel and indifferent, self-loving and idolatrous, drowning and overwhelming. Let us pour out our spirit in the rolling waters of God's promise in a world which thirsts for justice. If anyone would like to respond. Let us then continue in silence. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, my brothers and sisters. Go in love, justice, and peace until we meet again.